Buildings are basically the accumulated knowledge and the accumulated living patterns of people over time. What I find so fascinating about living in South Florida is that we have a very narrative architecture. Buildings do tell us a lot about how the city was founded, the evolution of the city, the evolution of our ideas about the city, the ways in which we relate to being Miami or Miamian, and I think that Miami is a great example of being able to read the history of a place.
It's easier to read the history of some places through their buildings than other places because some cities have done a better job, some cities and towns and suburbs have done a better job of retaining their identity through their buildings by saving their buildings, and historic preservation plays a very strong role in allowing us to read the history of a city. Architecture is our imprint on the land, and it tells us what people were, what the aspirations and the hopes and the fears and the successes and the triumphs and the failures were of any given time.
This land, flat as a tabletop, rock and sand covered with curly-topped Caribbean pines and palmetto scrub, as far as the eye could see, rose slightly as it neared the bay and formed a hammock, the tropical name for forest. There, live oaks, ironweed trees, the gumbo limbo, the strangler fig crowded each other, making a jungle cool and pungent, away from the piercing rays of the constant sun.
Miami. The name inevitably conjures up the notion of a paradisiacal place, the Magic City, a tropical wonderland, the American Riviera, the Boom City. Miami is as much an idea as an assemblage of individual memories and man-built forms among an intractable natural landscape. This city developed quite literally as a city in the garden. So pervasive was the lushness of the surrounding wilderness. From sandbars to wetlands, the bay, limestone ridges, freshwater springs and rivers, and the sky, nature was ever present. Nature kindled the imagination of the people who migrated to South Florida.
We have this flat land, we have this stage, and we also have the opportunity to have landscape and exotic plants, beautiful tropical flowers grow almost overnight. We can create a very exotic landscape, and we have had a very exotic landscape thanks to the likes of John Fairchild and others who imported any number of plants to Miami, but also thanks to the hurricanes that blew in trees and seedlings from the Caribbean.
To understand Miami's architecture is to experience the complex and shifting relationship that exists between natural and man-made environments. This duality is the foundation underpinning much of the city's distinctive appeal. From its beginnings, South Florida's subtropical architecture echoed a landscape mostly defined by its openness, lushness, and luminosity. Architecture has been framed and contained by the hinterland, the raw materiality of South Florida's landscape, its dense pinewood and mangrove forests. Ubiquitous palm trees and limestone ridges was not only the source for construction materials, but has served as the source of architectural ideas and forms. Nowadays, a tamed nature has become petrified, and the upright palm tree has become the city's most recognizable symbol. We often find among the white towers that have become the signature of Miami's contemporary urban skyline the vanishing traces of a city that once was. As a leading expression of material culture, buildings are the embodiment of the aspirations, values, and the struggles of their builders and inhabitants. In looking at Miami's architecture, we wonder, can we understand the culture and history of such a complex place by just looking at its buildings? What can architecture tell us about places such as Coconut Grove or the streets of downtown Miami? How can our national and local history be expressed in structures like Little Havana's bungalows or the resort hotels of Miami Beach? What is the meaning of Coral Gables' old Spanish tile roofs, or Opalaca's domes and minarets?
I think architecture is always connected to the question of technology, and technology is always changing. And so we can track the history of our culture architecturally through the development of the technology of building. But I think it's also connected with the way we live. I think architecture is also reflective of identity. And I think that's a very big theme in South Florida. If you look back through many decades, in fact, if you look back to the foundation of the city in the late 19th century, I think it's pretty clear that Miami architects, builders, developers, civic leaders have been involved in creating the idea of Miami through building works. And that has just continued and been amplified over many years.
Miami's architectural history has been enriched by the ethnic diversity of its builders and the building traditions they imported. For these newcomers, South Florida meant a new life. It seems that the history of Miami is nothing but the stories of other places. The diversity of South Florida's architectural heritage is rooted in the personal stories of the periodic waves of immigrants that built up Miami's landscape. South Florida's built landscape allows us to recognize the commonality of these experiences and to comprehend the significant role that architecture has played in forging a common regional identity. A vast majority of the individuals and families that migrated to South Florida came from northeastern and midwestern states. From the impoverished builders hired to lay down railroad tracks and build downtown Miami's first houses, to business entrepreneurs and speculators such as Henry Flagler, George Merrick, and Glenn Curtis. Although immigrants' motives to move to South Florida were varied, whether for economic, social, or political reasons, architecture has served as a filter through which to see the new through the old.
So we have had people migrating to this area for the last just 115 years for a great variety of reasons, and the migrants have brought tremendously different backgrounds with them as they've come to the area. And Bahamian people, especially black Bahamian people, brought that great architectural tradition of the West Indies and West Africa, which was defined in what we call shotgun houses in Coconut Grove. And there was a black Bahamian community, which is surprising to a lot of people, that straddled Cayocho between about today's Expressway at 4th and Southwest 8th Avenue. And once upon a time, there was a tremendous array of shotgun houses there. Very simple buildings, asymmetrically located entranceway, wood frame, open porch, one story. All the rooms radiate off of a asymmetrically located hallway on the side, one side of the house. And then the bungalow comes. And the bungalow wasn't really brought by immigrant groups per se. It actually kind of migrated from India to Southern California to the rest of the United States. And that becomes a dominant style in Miami at the end of the 1910s through at least the mid-1920s.
The introduction of craftsman bungalows in Miami signaled the expanding suburbanization of the city that was made possible by cable streetcars and the automobile. The bungalow became emblematic of an expanding urban economy and thriving progressive middle class. It introduced a new aesthetic of functionality and simplicity that helped reinforce Miami's image as a ready-made, subtropical paradise in the decades ahead.
And then we've got this wonderful streamline or Art Deco style. And that style wasn't so much brought by people, but was introduced by architects who came from somewhere else. Henry Hohauser from New York, and L. Murray Dixon from Live Oak, Florida, Albert Annis from Chicago. They were introduced to that style as architects. And they were hired by contractors down here to build these new buildings, primarily in the second half of the 30s and thereafter, and they built them in this streamline or Art Deco style of architecture. So it's been really an array of influences. This is such a vibrant community in so many different ways, and architecture and immigration are things that have driven this community in terms of its vibrancy.
Miami and neighboring cities like Miami Beach were built on tourism and clever self-promotion.
As we see, Miami Beach is a city of hotels, nearly 400 of them, beside the beaches and amid the palms of lusciously landscaped islands. A city where work and play can be combined in the greatest ease and comfort. A community not only of modern lodgings, but also of picturesque swimming pools, smooth beaches, and limitless vistas over a dimpling ocean of deepest blue.
Since the late 19th century, South Florida was gradually developed as a place for leisurely living. It became a cosmopolitan resort town, aided by promotional fantasies emphasizing its exotic allure. Architecture was turned into a marketing device through which traditional architectural styles were co-opted in the branding of an experience that was self-indulgent, exotic, and sophisticated.
I think that the use of historic styles in Miami Beach has largely been associated with Miami itself as being a place that you can reinvent yourself, you can invent your life, you can reinvent your context. In some ways, it was perceived, although I think inaccurately, as a blank slate. I mean, I think that was the problem. The Everglades, the very fragile environment that we live in. I think the subtlety of that fragile environment of the Everglades and the flora and the fauna kind of led people to believe that they could create a new world, and those new worlds were often old worlds. So you would fantasize about living in a Spanish village if you moved to Coral Gables as it was advertised, or you would, or you could live in an Italianate villa like the Skya, and that you used that opportunity, the opportunity of not having anything really built before the 20th century, built by Europeans at least, or Americans from European descent. Before that was helped to create this environment in which you could do what you wanted. Miami has always seemed to have been, for good and for bad, a place of tourism and escape, and that both of those lend themselves to the creation of environments that help you to do just that. And so, as opposed to being a place of industry and commerce. And one of the great challenges over the 20th century has been to create in Miami something that lasts beyond the fantasy and becomes part of really what is essentially South Florida.
Miami's social-cultural history percolates through the narrative of its pioneer settlements and towns. These so-called edge communities have been incorporated over time and now comprise the urban nodes of a vast metropolitan area: Lemon City, Buena Vista, Coconut Grove, Homestead, Miami Beach, Coral Gables, Hialeah, and Opa-locka. Some of these communities were conceived around specific architectural themes, and their diverse ethnic backgrounds are part of Miami's distinct and porous urban imagery.
Why is this American? Because the influences come from France, and the influences come from Spain, and the influences come from South America. And yet, if you look at the history of American architecture, the idea of architecture actually being American is a relatively new one. And in a way, the Americanness of architecture until the 1950s was in its vernacular architecture, in the handmade architecture, and architecture as an expression of wealth or power was always about imported architecture. You see the pioneer buildings that are small and quaint and sweet. Ransom Everglades School, for example, has the pagoda, and the earliest buildings there derived from its founders' roots in the Adirondacks.
Miami's extraordinary growth facilitated the development of an experimental architectural culture that often pitted tradition against innovation, but eventually fused them. This process fostered a creative tension that became a defining theme that runs through our architecture, and is apt to be found in everything from the so-called lowbrow cottages in Coconut Grove to the skyscrapers rising along Prickle Avenue.
I think it becomes clear that here in Miami, on the frontier of North America, let's say, at the margins of North America, architects felt a certain liberty to play with the rules and to play with the materials and to depart from the norms. One could make the argument that people expected things in Miami to be different, and therefore architects were only delivering on that promise or on that expectation. That it would have been counterproductive for resort architects to design buildings that looked like they were in New York or like they were in Boston or like they were in Berlin. So I think that, true enough, architects were trying to do something different.
Miami is a city which architecture has transformed. Two historical periods roughly define Miami's architectural development. In the ensuing decades after Miami's incorporation, architecture reshaped the wilderness, and the accumulating layers of architectural styles cemented Miami's reputation as a national vacation destination. In the aftermath of the Second World War, a new generation of architects advanced the conception of a new paradigm of subtropical architecture, aiming to assert the region's exceptionality. 1950s architecture, popularly known as the International style, with its emblematic diaphanous curtain walls, morphs into Miami modern architecture, otherwise known as MIMO. This architecture challenges the corporate American architecture of the period, blending in contemporary international influences ranging from Brazil to Mexico. Miami's modern architecture acted as a bridge between North and South America and the Caribbean.
The South Florida component is interesting because South Florida is really, I think, most significant for its positioning globally as a threshold between land and water, between North and South, between hot tropics and the cool temperate zones. South Florida reflects a kind of a place in flux and a place that has continuous motion.
I think that one interesting aspect of Miami as an architectural environment is that it is at the juncture of two different ecologies, two different environments. It's at the intersection of North America and the Caribbean and Latin America. And I think that plays out in many ways, but historically, Miami has been a North American city. It's interesting to see how developers, architects arrive in Miami and express the idea of the tropics or the idea of the South or the idea of a more Caribbean or even Spanish-influenced architecture. But it does come out of the American perspective, the American experience. At the same time, what's interesting is that there is this dialogue with the American experience. I think some of the desire to be tropical, some of the desire to be Southern or to be Spanish colonial has to do with, in a way, differentiating oneself from the North. Miami has sort of constructed a kind of alternative experience, alternative modern experience to the experience of living and working in a northeastern or a northern American city.
In learning from Miami's architecture, we appreciate the complexity of a history that has been expressed through idiosyncratic architectural experiences. It is an architectural history defined partially by its utopianism and on the other hand by its pragmatism. Miami is a place for which tradition has been manufactured and recreated, appropriating layers of architectural history in order to define a cosmopolitan identity.
We are an invented city. This is a very modern city, very contemporary city. It has shallow roots, but in the process of that invention, it's still remarkable how many ideas and how many layers have been added in so short a time. But they're there, and they influence each other. I find it nowhere more resonant than in the city of Miami Beach, where any one block in South Beach is likely to have all of those layers extant, restored, preserved, protected, all on one block.
Miami partially functions as an imagined place that exists under the shadows of architectural fictions, an imaginative narrative that architects, builders, and planners exploited for all it's worth. We find here a compressed survey of the worldwide architecture unequivocally built in a few decades of frenzied real estate development. This syncretic narrative encompasses a wide and ample range of architectural themes and stylistic elements freely borrowed from all periods of the history of architecture.
Some of the buildings that I think represent what we are today as a place include the Caribbean Marketplace that Charles Harrison Pauly designed about, I guess, 20 years ago now, which was itself threatened for a period of time in Little Haiti. And it just shows, you know, the exuberance of an immigrant culture bringing its culture here. And I think that Haiti is such a bright and vibrant sensibility about color and depicting place in paintings and in the way that the houses are painted. But I love the way that building expresses a kind of Caribbean sensibility that we have in Miami. The Art Deco district to me is very important in many, many ways. Architecturally speaking, it's had a profound impact on Miami, both in its kind of sense of exuberance, and it's an international style. You find it around the world. You find our particular kind of Art Deco only in seaside communities. You find it in the south of France, you find it in Australia, you find it in Israel, but you don't find it everywhere. You don't find that kind of skyscraper style of the Empire State Building or the Chrysler Building everywhere. What you find here is smaller and stucco with a lot of applied ornament and some etched glass. What I think is very interesting architecturally speaking is that the buildings almost always have this kind of fascinating tension between the horizontal, because the buildings are very, very horizontal, and vertical. It's almost like a compression propulsion. There's always this kind of conversation between being horizontal and being vertical, between being tight going out and being tight and going up and soaring to the sky. And of course there's Vizcaya, which probably is one of the most important, if not the most important, house museums in America, but also expresses yet another way in which an incredible fantasy was brought from another place to Miami to make Miami more than it ever could have dreamed of being. And Vizcaya is, of course, an incredible Italian palazzo, a Venetian palazzo recreated here with beautiful gardens, and at one point it had canals, and it had these incredible little farm outbuildings that are more Tuscan than Venetian, and the whole thing brought together is probably as beautiful and significant a destination to see architecture and the decorative arts and landscape as anything in America. And of course, there's always the Freedom Tower, which I think is in many ways Miami's symbol, even though ironically there were 3 buildings built at the same time with related towers, the Biltmore, the Freedom Tower, and the Roney Plaza. And this one, the Freedom Tower, of course, started out life as the Miami News Building, but its elegance and the way it meets the sky and are truly just breathtaking every time you see them.
For me, Miami's most enduring architectural style is the modern, and that is because not only did modern sort of offer some new ways of doing things that were seized upon by Miami architects to open up a whole new realm of architecture, a whole new realm of expression, but I think it's that very process of appropriation that makes Miami interesting, that offered Miami architects a way to redefine what they were doing. And out of the experimentation in modern architecture comes very direct responses to a tropical environment, to sort of warm weather, humid environment. And therefore, I think Miami gets closest to defining in its architecture what it is about as a city in the modern. I'm thinking, you know, the concrete plate architecture that allowed architects to open up the walls, to create walls out of screens or louvers. I'm thinking about a very lightweight architecture, an architecture that sat off the ground, above the ground, an architecture of large, open, free-flowing spaces, an architecture of modern lightweight materials. These were very important developments that are partly general and international in character, but really take on a whole new spirit in Miami. And that's particularly true for resort architecture. It was in resort architecture where Miami architects like Morris Lapidus, Norman Giller begin to invent new forms, a much more expressive facade architecture. They begin to experiment with textures, with motifs, modernistic motifs like delta wings or like glass boxes that I think are really still today the image of Miami for many tourists, for many residents.
Given the city's accelerated growth, the pressures of development, and urban consolidation in such a short span of time, we have lost significant places and structures. Herein lays the challenge of preserving an architectural heritage that is constantly compromised by the pressures of real estate.
In Miami, the land has always had a value beyond its buildings, and you could call it shifting sands. It's sad, but this is a place that has always brought in newcomers who don't share the heritage, and our critical job has always been to spread a kind of common appreciation for that heritage, for that cultural patrimony, for the living history of Miami's architecture. I think that Miami Beach itself and Coral Gables and a number of cities in Dade County, in Miami-Dade County, have pretty strong preservation laws, but they crumble in the face of certain needs. We could probably go through a long list of buildings, important big ones and very tiny small ones that add up to something far larger than the individual building might account for. For example, Miami's rich array of bungalows, and an important architectural subject that a kind of house that was small, often mail order, and because it descended from an Indian, as in East India, prototype, basically was perfectly suited for the tropics, and was a wildly popular housing style in the teens and early part of the 1920s particularly, but they're small and they're little, and it doesn't matter that they're sweet and cute and important and add up to something, again, much larger than each individual bungalow. They're not what people with large aspirations fueled by money and television and advertising want to live in.
Miami's architectural narrative has become a sort of theatrical background against which we read our city's events and its personalities. From the city's first resort hotel, the French Second Empire Royal Palm Hotel built by Henry Flagler, Al Capone's Italianate mansion on Palm Island, Casa Casuarina, sadly tied forever to the murder of Gianni Versace, and Elian Gonzalez's Little Pink House in Little Havana, we understand and most importantly place ourselves within our city and its history, always in relationship to specific buildings or places. The old Miami News Building, now the Freedom Tower, the Biltmore Hotel, the Venetian Pool, Calle Ocho, and Lincoln Road. Architecture ultimately offers important lessons. It is Miami's most enduring link to its past and a signpost to its future.
I like to think of South Florida as a laboratory of architecture. The lessons of South Florida are to be found in the process of assimilation, the process of appropriation, the process of identification, and how architecture plays a role in all of those processes.
The major lessons are, one, the potential and the opportunity to work closely with the environment, and so it's about the light and the air and the temperature and the fauna and the flora. The second one is probably a more cautionary tale about working in an environment of booms and busts and a great opportunity, but also the great opportunity for disaster and for overzealous development. And we're a place where this is a textbook lesson. And maybe the third is a kind of celebration of the complexity that arises on the edge, whether it's a political edge or a geographic edge. And that since we all live here on the edge, we, I think, naturally kind of embody this a more nuanced understanding of what it means to be from Miami, what it means to be American, what it means to be a global citizen today.
I think the lessons of South Florida have to do then with this process of acknowledging that we are a layered city, that we are new, that we create our own identity, that results from all of these different ideas about identity, and that we don't have to make choices one way or the other about we're going to be this layer or we're going to be that layer. And that's such a fascinating lesson, and one that I think South Florida offers better than almost any other place that I can think of. That's what makes it American.